Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I've been thinking a lot lately about how leaders really try to digest the information that they get from the people in their organization who are helping them make decisions around strategy. And one thing I've really noticed uh, especially externally, when people talk in the news, or you see leaders talking about their strategies, or you on the news articles, you see the kind of talking heads talking about how scenarios might play out. I realize that there's this confusion that leaders are confusing scenarios with trials. So with me today, virtually here, we have Dr. Sam Savage and Dr. Sarah Lukens, and they are certainly experts in this area. Dr. Savage is the Executive Director of Probability Management and an adjunct professor at the University of Stanford, and also the author of The Flaw of Averages. And Dr. Sarah Lukens is a data scientist at GE Digital, working on helping to analyze asset performance and helping to determine where those breaks and fixes are going to occur. And most importantly to this conversation, she did her postdoctoral research at the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Notre Dame in contagion models. So Sarah and I and Sam, we had a conversation. We wanted to really just start off right off the bat. The three of us, how do we define scenarios and trials? And so scenarios are future versions of the world. So if you are a sci-fi fan, you'll think of like the multiverse. And they're really centered around specific events versus specific variations in uncertainty. So let's take a look at how, first, I got some questions for Sam. Sam, what's your best example of a scenario versus a trial?
Well, the first thing to say is the terms are not terribly well defined, and therefore you need to define them within your organization. Trials, as I use the term, and this is the way I think they should be used. So think of simulation as shaking a ladder before you climb on it. And you're bombarding it with random forces and you're monitoring the outputs. Known as Monte Carlo simulation, developed in 1947 as part of the Manhattan Project. So think of a trial as a single ladder shake. Scenarios are more like, oh, am I setting my ladder up against the side of my house to paint my house? Am I setting it up over broken beer bottles? Am I setting up next to a shark tank? Those are scenarios. And under each scenario, you're going to shake the ladder. And the shakes are the trials.
And Sarah, same question to you. Like, what's your best example of a scenario versus a trial?
Okay, well, relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, scenarios would be different mitigation strategies, different reopening strategies, such as doing nothing, closing schools, reopening schools under a certain policy. Each of those is a different scenario, versus a trial is different occurrences, different paths that the scenario could take. And ideally, you're going to want to look at several to account for all the uncertainty.
Well, that's kind of exactly the message that we want to try to send today. So let's first start with what I call the first problem. And I think this is people are very wedded to single point estimates, single trials or single estimates on an event that has a lot of uncertainty and variability in it. And so, this picture that we see here, let's say you have a leader that comes to you and says, hey, I want you to build me a very sophisticated model of COVID and what's going to happen over the next 24 months. And so you go ahead and you build this sophisticated single point estimate, and you come up with something like this. And this is actually something I took offline by Thomas Payo and his epidemic calculator. And you kind of set all the variables at one point and say, what happens? What's the infections? How many people end up in the hospital? How many people were exposed, et cetera, over a given time period? And so let's kind of set this thing in motion. Let's start playing with the numbers. And Sarah, I'm going to come to you and say, what are some of the biggest insights you've seen with COVID-19 that can only be seen through a stochastic model versus a single point estimate.
Okay, well, I'm going to make the comment too that there's also a danger of using models for how they're not intended. In terms of stochastic modeling, some of the insights is that, for instance, going back to this model, it's based on SIR, which stands for susceptible, infectious, removed. You can see that in the left column, and it's a compartmental model. It assumes that you've got a homogeneous transmission, meaning everything's equal. And the epidemic starts to wane when we reach herd immunity. Now, I'm not sure what the exact numbers are for herd immunity for COVID-19. I've seen anywhere between 40% to 90% of the population. Doesn't matter, those are all bigger than what we're actually experiencing. And in reality, the path of these the epidemic should be traced with more stochastic simulation to account for this randomness and uncertainty that we don't know about, that is not captured so much in these models.
So I guess like the first question that I have for you, Sam, is, so what's your perspective if someone makes this the basis of doing all the decisions within an organization?
Right. Well, this is a disaster that I call the flaw of averages. Mathematicians have known about this for over 100 years. And if you go to the next slide here, it kind of explains the flaw of averages. Consider a drunk wandering down a busy highway. His average position is the center line. This means that the state of the drunk at his average position is alive, but obviously on average, he's dead. So the slide you showed earlier, just previous, is assuming the drunk is in the middle of the road. And that's a terrible, terrible assumption. So the trials in this case, by the way, are the different paths the drunk could take. Imagine repeating the drunk 1,000 times, right? And each path, you're looking at one path in this picture, but consider 1,000 such paths. And by the way, in virtually on any of the paths, the drunk ends up dead. Now, the scenario in this case is, what kind of road is it? Is it Route 66? Is it John Denver's country road? I don't know, is it a cow path? But it is disastrous, especially with something with as much uncertainty as a pandemic, to assume that a single average case is going to occur. And I want to follow up on that, and that is, it has not been easy to do. And recent standards and improvements in like Excel, and everyone's got R and Python, recent improvements in both standards and technology are making it much easier to do.
I think I'd really like, why don't we go ahead and why don't you show us, an example of the flaw of averages, especially, and kind of talk about, how wrong could it be if a leader just wants to dig in on this one scenario with average assumptions?
Sure. Let me do the simplest thing I can think of. It involves, say, the uncertainty in requirements of ICU beds. And just to set the stage, if you have this disease and you go into a hospital and they don't have an ICU bed for you, the mortality rate goes up like by a factor of 10, right?
Yeah.
You need that oxygen. So let's assume an incredibly simple version of this uncertainty. So you could either need no ICU beds, 100 ICU beds, or 200 ICU beds, high, medium, or low. Suppose these have equal probability, right? Well, obviously the average number of beds is 100. Oh, if you don't believe me, there's the average statement, as in the flaw of averages. Okay, now let's ask what the consequences are. Well, of course, hey, we're going to plan for the average, right? Of course we are. So we're going to secure 100 ICU beds. By the way, if you have a low pandemic, we'll only have one fatality with 100 beds. if you require 100 beds and you have 100 beds, you're going to have 10 fatalities. Oh, if you had 100 beds and you needed 200 beds, you're going to have 100 fatalities. Yikes.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. So the fatalities given the average contagion is 10. Let's average all these things that could happen. That's 37. 10 does not equal 37. That's pretty obvious. That's the flaw of averages. And just to put it into another perspective, many of you have probably heard of a statistician who drowns in the river that's on average 3 feet deep. But let me give you the formal statement here of the flaw of averages. That is, plans based on average assumptions are wrong on average. Let me give you a slightly more sophisticated model here. So here's one that's available at my blog on our nonprofit's website. So I'm just going to talk about, say flattening the curve. Flatten, flatten, flatten. And as we flatten, up here we have the expected number of fatalities. So we can see we're expecting 14.2% fatalities. Now I flatten the curve and I get that down to, say, 2.6%. Yay. Now let me introduce uncertainty. Oh, and you see that gray line? That's the cliff.
Mm-hmm.
That's how many ICU beds you have. So now let me click on simulation here. And the red line is a particular contagion path given, say, your standard error in the infection rate or the reproductive rate. So, well, that could happen, or that could happen, or that could happen. And if I average over all those things happening, I discover that, no, I don't have 2.6% fatalities. I have 4.7. It's like almost doubled. Right? I mean, so there's a more realistic example. Still what I'd call a paper airplane model, just to help you understand what's going on.
I mean, that's a really powerful demonstration. And so, Sarah, you have a lot of experience with these sort of models, and ones that are much more sophisticated and very real and have a lot of depth to them. How do you get a leader that's not a statistician to start kind of understanding these outputs from these models?
Well, actually, I think that demo that we just got by Sam is probably pretty compelling because it does two key things. It's a great visualization. People love visualizations. We love storytelling, and we also love tying messages to so what. And I think that was also conveyed. So I actually think elements of that demo are some of the key elements to communicate it. I will comment, though, that it's a challenge because you need to have your story. It has to be crisp. It has to not ramble, and it has to be to the point before you communicate it to your leader.
That's
not easy.
That's great feedback, and it certainly is not easy. And I would say, as someone that's newer in this realm, I certainly struggle with that and spend a lot of time focusing on that story message and connecting it to the outputs that really inform the decision that they're making. So, okay, so this is great because now we've solved this problem. So you go and you build your sophisticated model, and you come up with, let's say, a simulated average expected scenario. And I find the next thing that a lot of people want to do, and this is a great accountant's risk management kind of flaw of thinking. They say, oh, I just want to make sure that we're going to be okay. And I want you to sensitivity test it. So I want you just to create a table like this for me, Sam and Sarah, where my expected scenario is in the middle. And I just want you to push one lever up and push one lever down and push the other one up, another down, put them all up, put them all down, and just make sure that nothing ever bad happens. And so I'm curious, starting with Sarah, what do you think the leader is going to get real decision-making value out of this kind of exhibit?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that there is some value. It's a number greater than 0 because, for instance, if you turn a lever a little bit and the results move extremely, or you move the lever a little bit and the results don't really move much at all. There's value and insights in that. But in general, you're missing the full value that you could be getting. One I spoke earlier mentioned the problem with misunderstanding models from how they originally intended, or modeling, not actually modeling what decision you wanted to make. These are dangers that I think are baked into this, because the intention of having these levers is to try to see the uncertainty that could happen across different scenarios, but that's not really what's happening. So fundamentally, it's a misunderstanding that's going on, which is a danger, and again, not as value if you could. And you could also be missing insights too, because this is a very small picture, and by looking at one dimension change at a time, you could be missing something that could actually happen.
And Sam, so you have great experience with helping enterprises optimize their decision making. Can you build a good strategy off this kind of exhibit?
Well, here's what's missing to me about this. Imagine that you had two dice, and someone says, "I want you to give me the low, expected, and high scenario." I say, well, the low is you roll a 2. The high is you roll a 12. And the one in the middle is you roll a 7. Now, what this does not let you know is there's only one possible way to get a 2. You have to roll 2 ones. One way to get a 12, you have to roll 2 6. But to get a 7, you can roll a 1, a 6, a 6, a 1, a 5, and a 4. All these, 5 and a 2, 2 and a 5. All these ways you can get a 7. That's completely wiped out of this. And so when you run a simulation, what you actually do is you roll the dice 10,000 times, and it's complicated, right? Which is why you have to do it 10,000 times. And you can then start studying those results. And this is kind of one of the big breakthroughs that our nonprofit is supporting, is you store those results as data. And you go back after in the simulation, it says, under this condition, we had some disaster. And you start filtering your data on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Power BI or something. Well, what happened when we had the disaster? Oh my gosh, that's when we got a 4 on the first die, right? And a 2 on the second die. And actually, this is called Bayesian analysis in some circles. We can run this thing backwards and find out why did this disaster occur. But again, now we're looking at 10,000 possible occurrences, as opposed to just saying, it could be a 2, or it could be a 7, or it could be a 12. And that kind of covers what 2 dice do.
And I think that makes sense, because you can't prepare a strategy for everything. You have to prepare your strategy to withstand a reasonable range of probabilistic outcomes. And so this kind of tends to push everything to the extreme.
Well, wait a minute. And so that's absolutely right. So for example, if you go to Las Vegas to play craps, your strategy is based on the fact that 7s are more likely. It's not just the middle case. It's more likely. And that doesn't even account for the fact that in the real world, not only are the dice loaded, but they're interrelated. Think of a bunch of dice that have magnets in them. So when this one comes up 4, this one's more likely to come up 2, that kind of stuff. You have to capture all those things. And that's why simulation is really a wonderful way to go. It hasn't been forever. I'm saying, recent technological breakthroughs have made this much more prevalent.
So here's my maybe solution to that I would throw out there. So that when trying to communicate the true scenario and then the trials or variability that can occur with this scenarios, you might look at something like, hey, okay, we're now trying to build a business strategy around what's going to happen over the next 24 months with COVID-19. Okay, we have an expected scenario and we're going to show the simulated average, our kind of downside to a certain tolerance or upside to a certain tolerance. And then that important measure, decision point. What's the % chance that our hospital capacity is going to be overloaded. Then we take a look at a couple scenarios, real, likely, or maybe ones that are totally impossible, so that we can plan in advance how our strategy is going to change and adapt to these sort of things and the variability they bring forward. So you might say, as Sarah mentioned before, the full reopening in the fall, a second heavy lockdown, what happens in those particular things. So, this is really fantastic. And so my kind of takeaways from this are, number one, don't confuse the idea of a scenario with your trials. Number two, you got to avoid the flaw of averages. You have to start bringing that view of uncertainty into your estimates. You have to create the visualizations and let your leaders and your business owners play around with the input so they can see the applied portion of these models. And then finally, the way to get into this is you have to start. You have to pick a small digestible solution in your company or your organization, wherever it might be, and start trying to build out your first models with this. And so I want to thank both of you for helping me out here today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all that you do, both at GE Digital, Sarah, and at Probability Management, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Justin.
All right. Have a great day.